now introduce our speakers. Today, we are privileged to have Leigh Davis and Samantha Crane with us speaking about autism and criminal justice. Leigh Davis has over 20 years of experience in the intellectual, developmental disability, and criminal justice fields. She has worked with disability and criminal justice professionals and agencies, and also people with disabilities, to build stronger lines of communication and understanding between these two worlds. She seeks to ensure that people with intellectual developmental disability, whether suspect, offender, victim, or witness, have access to accommodations in the criminal justice system. She has authored numerous publications on criminal justice topics, and she gives presentations and trainings at state, national, and international conferences to enlighten others about the unique issues faced by people with intellectual and developmental disabilities in the criminal justice system. She holds master's degrees in social work and public administration. Samantha Crane, a graduate of Harvard Law School, previously served as staff attorney at the Asin Center of Mental Health Law. In that job, she focused on enforcing the right to community integration as established by the Supreme Court in Olmstead v. LC. She has also been an associate at the litigation firm Quinn Emanuel Urquhart & Sullivan, LLP, where her focus was patent and securities litigation. From 2009 to 2010, Samantha served as law clerk to Judge William H. Yon at the U.S. District Court for the Eastern District of Pennsylvania. It's our extreme pleasure to have Leigh and Samantha with us today, so without further ado, take it away, Leigh.
All right, thank you so much, and I'm very excited to be on this webinar today, and I thank Spark for inviting myself and our co-presenter as well. This is an issue near and dear to both of our hearts, and it's exciting just to be able to share what we've learned over the years and also think about what we can do in the future and some solutions. So with that, I just wanted to briefly introduce where I work. I didn't put a slide in on this, but I wanted to let you know about the ARC. Maybe many of you are familiar with the ARC. The ARC is has been around for a long time, over 60 years, and started because parents wanted more for their children who were in institutions at the time. The ARC has built up in many different ways over the past over 60 years to now we've got over 660 chapters nationwide, and we focus on a number of different issues including employment and health care. And the one issue that I've been involved with since I've been at the ARC has been criminal justice issues. In 1994 is when I originally started with the ARC, and at that time there was a big focus on death penalty issues. But what's really interesting about this issue is that it's so diverse in terms of all of the different areas that it touches in a person's life who has autism and other intellectual developmental disabilities. There's sexual violence issues. There's sex offenses. We do quite a bit of work around that, people who have been accused of sex offenses. There's juvenile justice issues, so I'm sure you've heard of the school-to-prison pipeline. And more recently, we've really been focused on intersectionality and all of the different issues around that. So at the ARC, we got a grant about 4 years ago to create the ARC's National Center on Criminal Justice and Disability. And that's what we continue to operate now. And that really gave us the chance to create a training called Pathways to Justice to really get this information to police officers, to attorneys, and to the victim service providers. And so we're going into communities and creating teams of these individuals working alongside people with disabilities and their family members to address specific issues in their community that continue to keep people with disabilities from getting access to our criminal justice system. So that's kind of an overview of the ARC, of our National Center on Criminal Justice and Disability, and I'll talk a little bit more about the center at the end of my presentation, and you'll be able to see our website and get more information on that. So for our topic of discussion for today, what we want to do is focus on not only individual strategies that people can use to address this issue, but also systems reform. And three primary areas we're looking at is how do we reduce unnecessary police interactions, as well as improve access to emergency services, and then ensure access to effective communication. And in my years working on this topic, one of the primary issues is that one right there, effective communication. So many of these issues could have had a much better outcome had there been an opportunity to have good communication between the person with the disability, the autistic person, and the criminal justice system, whether that be the law enforcement officer or an attorney or someone who's trying to help them who works in the victim's field. So the communication issue is very important and something we'll look at today. We know that autistic people face serious challenges when they get involved in the criminal justice system, and we'll look at some of the research on that, and that these challenges can pose serious threats to their safety. So I think one of the things that we want to look at before we go into those specific ways of thinking through how do we do something individually as a parent, as a person with autism, we need to think about this more globally. How do we create this culture of prevention? Seemingly what happens often is that we've got more of a focus on what do we have to do today. So much of this work requires those of us who are advocates, or if you're a parent and you've been in this situation, or you're a person with an autistic person who's been in this situation, it feels like we have to focus and be reactive on what we have to do right now. So what we'd like to do today is take a step back and think of this more in a proactive way and think through how do we create this culture of prevention. And we know that one of the key answers to this is that we need to think through how are we educating our criminal justice system about this issue. And one of the things, too, that we've realized is that often whenever you go to train police officers or talk to law enforcement, for example, about people with disabilities who get involved in the system or who are arrested or who are victimized, there's often this idea more around crisis intervention. And some of you may be familiar of what's called crisis intervention team programs. And that's a type of training that law enforcement get when they are looking to learn more about mental health or psychiatric disabilities, which is also referred to as mental illness. And much of the training that officers get when they get training around disability issues is primarily focused on that in that area around mental health. And so what we'd like to do is really broaden that for law enforcement throughout the country and help them see that this is broader than mental health only, and that we need to do more training around autism, around other intellectual developmental disabilities, many of which don't have a specific diagnosis attached to it. And another question that we're asking law enforcement is how do we define a crisis? And I think this is a really important question because how an officer might define a crisis when they are seeing someone who is autistic is very different than how that person who has autism would define that, or a caregiver, for example. And that's one of the first things we discuss in the trainings that we provide is talking through what a crisis looks like to different people who are in that room. And we also ask, do you think that autistic people most often come into contact with officers in crisis situations? Has law enforcement kind of thought that through and thought about maybe there's something I could have done before something was escalated into a crisis? So it's important to think about these interactions and help law enforcement understand how they can walk through those different scenarios and think about when did that crisis start occurring in their mind, and how could that have been actually work through so it didn't escalate into an actual crisis. And then I'd already mentioned the CIT programs. We're really wanting to broaden that to looking more at autism and other intellectual developmental disabilities. And what is encouraging is that we do see police departments now developing policies on intellectual and developmental disabilities. In the trainings that we've done thus far, there's been a couple of police departments that are being proactive in this and looking at developing a specific policy just on this population. So there are signs of definitely openness and awareness in having a plan and being more proactive with this population specifically. So I briefly referred to Pathways to Justice, and I want to tell you a little bit about it just because what I'm going to share with you in these next few slides comes from this training program. And so I wanted you to know where it came from and to let you know that you can look up this information on the website that is there on your screen where it shows the Pathways to Justice web link. But just to give you an overview, so through our National Center, we created a Pathways to Justice training. And what's exciting about this one-day training is that it's more than a training because we help create these disability response teams made up of a law enforcement officer, an attorney, a victim service provider, person with disabilities, and then the main disability agency that's helping to facilitate the training. And we work with these individuals before we ever get into the training day itself to prepare for how we will train together on the topic. And then at the end of the training, we do an action plan together so that we get feedback from everyone who is in that training about different ways that we can address the issues that their community specifically is facing regarding the topic. So what's exciting about that is that we get a broad reach to a number of different professions. We understand and we will say that there's not just one answer to this issue and that there's a lot of different expertise in the room. Law enforcement brings a different viewpoint than a family member would, than an attorney might. And when we get them around tables together talking it through case scenarios that involve people with autism and other intellectual disabilities, it really creates more of a buy-in and a shared vision of what they could be doing together that they didn't have before. We also focus on what are specific steps that different professionals can do to address the situation. And that's where you see the 4 steps include identifying disability, learning how to communicate with individuals, assessing situations, and then knowing what are some ongoing support that that person will need in the community. And I also wanted to show this Pathways to Justice model. And what this is a picture or a graphic of the criminal justice system. And as you'll see there, at the very beginning, it shows community moving into first contact, then into investigation, into jail, then to trial plea agreement, to transition, and then back in the community. And this model was a way for us to break down and look at each part of the criminal justice system in its own area and think through how are we identifying if the person has autism, for example, in each of these areas. How are we able to make sure they can communicate with people in the system and vice versa? How are we assessing the situation? This is especially important for law enforcement. They need to assess the situation and be able to tell how they can provide accommodations. And then lastly, how are we reaching out for support in the community? Are there other organizations? Are there other advocates we could be calling in to help us in making sure that we're serving people with disabilities in the most effective ways? So we like to use this model as a way to kind of get everyone in the room when we're doing these trainings on the same page and really have more of a picture in their minds of where they fit in the system. And the more they understand that if they don't play their role in helping someone with autism, then that person is more likely to go deeper and deeper into the system. And how it really improves everyone's lives and it benefits everyone, the earlier we can address these situations. Of course, not everyone feels perhaps the need to learn about different types of disabilities who are involved in the or who work inside the criminal justice system. And it's difficult. Professionals only have so much time in the day. Especially police officers, they've got to get to the next call. There's only so much you can fit in a training. And so we've really got to be conscious of all of the different barriers that these professionals may have and think through how do we make this the most easy way that they can access it, but also make it meaningful and make sure that what we're providing is something that they can use. So this is one of the slides that we would provide to make sure they understand why it's so important to learn about autism and other intellectual developmental disabilities. And we talk about the fact that this population is overrepresented in jails and prisons. We have data from the Bureau of Justice Statistics to show that. Also how because people with disabilities are often a hidden population because their disability is not physical in nature, and it can be it's a disability that you may not know the person has it. That's important to know as an officer so that you can, if you have any red flags going off in your mind about is there a possible disability, you'll know to do certain things in order to figure out if that might be the case instead of just assuming something about a person. And then also just the confusion about psychiatric and developmental disabilities. That's still very present in law enforcement. Unless they've had specific training on this topic, they often assume that everyone has a mental health issue, and they don't necessarily know about developmental disabilities or autism to the level that they need to understand it. We know that people with autism and intellectual disabilities are more likely to be victimized compared to people in the general population. And so I think that's important for law enforcement to understand so that they can be even more able and have an understanding of how high risk this population is. And we do talk about the liability issue. We talk about the Americans with Disabilities Act, and that it's law that people with disabilities receive the same access to services, and that it actually builds community trust when law enforcement are willing and wanting to learn about the disability community, and that they show that. These are just some examples of some of the statistics that we share in the training. We know that people with intellectual developmental disabilities, including autism, represent 4 to 10% of the prison population, with even more in juvenile facilities and jails. And this is an estimation and probably an underestimation because we don't have really good structure set up to get the data that we want. But this is from a number of different studies showing that we know that it is high. And then an estimated 70% of justice-involved youth have disabilities, and this is including both intellectual developmental disabilities and mental illness in that 70%. So when we look at juvenile justice issues, our center did a white paper just on juvenile justice issues that's on our website, and it really goes more into detail of all of the different challenges and what are some of the solutions we can look to when really wanting to support our youth who have disabilities. And these are the learning objectives that we go over in the training. And I should have mentioned from the beginning I was going to that I'm actually going to focus on the suspect-defendant issues, whereas Samantha, the co-presenter, she will be focused more on victims issues. So in our training, we go over both. We look at both defendant and victim issues. But for my presentation today, I'm pulling from the information that we show on defendants. So this is an example of our slide from the learning objectives and what we really want people, the professionals in the room, to walk away with. Having that good understanding of the difference between different disabilities is key. And now we don't want anyone to feel like they have to diagnose, because they can't. They're not. That's not their area of expertise to do that, but that they at least have an understanding of different types of disabilities so that they can take a step back, try to get some additional feedback, call their, if it's a law enforcement officer, call the sergeant. If it's an attorney, look to disability agencies or advocacy agencies to help give them more information about disability, et cetera. So we want them to understand that there are differences between the different disabilities and how that impacts how they are serving that person. Also learning effective interaction tips, communication tips, how to de-escalate those potentially dangerous situations. We spend quite a bit of time on that with law enforcement. We are really looking into how to provide all of this information into case-based scenarios, and using reality case-based scenarios, meaning that we take cases that we've worked on here at the National Center or that some of our chapters in our network have told us about, and we use those as actual cases to walk through different case scenarios with the officers. And what's really exciting too is that the crisis intervention team training that's already been going on for years around mental health issues, we're working with them to now include autism and other intellectual disabilities into the main training that those CIT offices are getting. So I think there's definitely more of an openness to seeing disability much more broadly than it's been looked at before in the criminal justice system. But we just need to make sure as advocates that we stay on top of that and make the most of these opportunities when we have these open doors, whether it's locally, statewide, or nationally. And then we need to be familiar with disability-specific issues that are common in prisons and jails. We talk about the need for better screening, the issues around solitary confinement, and then there's other issues that we touch on. And we also make sure that they know when they walk away from the training what the local resources are. We often have the printouts for them to take with them, or have that somewhere on a website where they can find, they can look up the ARC, they can look up autism organizations there locally, so that if an issue occurs again, they'll know where to go in the future. So these are some signs of regarding officer contact that we talk through with them, some signs that they may want to look for when they're encountering someone that they think might have a disability. And you can read those here. Difficulty communicating and expressing themselves. They may be easily influenced by and eager to please others. And we go into this one quite a bit, as it can be one of the riskier issues facing people with disabilities. As I've been working in the field for a number of years, I've seen way too often how people with disabilities can be used by other criminals, for example. I've seen this personally working on death penalty cases where 5 people were involved in being suspects of a murder, and only one person ends up being charged for that, and it's a person with an intellectual disability who often we find out later, and thanks to all of the technology we have just around DNA evidence, that the person did not do the crime. So there's real concerns around that one, just people wanting to please someone who's an authority, wanting to say what they want them to hear so that they can be released or feel safe. So that's an area of great concern. Some people may not want their disability to be known, so that's something we need officers to remember. The person may be unresponsive. That does not mean that the person is trying to disrespect an officer, for example. and that officers need to think twice about how they respond to unresponsiveness in a person and consider the potential of a disability. They may be overwhelmed by the officer's presence, try to run away, and have trouble making eye contact. And all of these, of course, to someone who doesn't know about autism or other disabilities like that, all of these things could be taken really the wrong way. So the more that the officers understand this, and this applies to attorneys and victim service providers too, the more that they're going to not jump to conclusions about the person. Now, we've been working with the International Association of Chiefs of Police for some time, for a few years now, and this is a national membership organization for police officers. It's the primary one nationally in the U.S., and they develop model policies on different topics for police nationally. This is not, of course, anything they have to use, that police departments have to use, but it kind of provides guidance on if different police departments want to provide policies in certain things. So we've been working with IACP to revise one of their policies on intellectual developmental disabilities, which includes autism. It was recently updated in 2017, and these are some of the common interactions that are mentioned in that officers need to look for in that policy. So people with intellectual developmental disabilities may be used by criminals without disabilities unknowingly, which we talked about a little bit. Often they can give false coerced confessions. They may look to have what seems to be offensive, and that's why I put the word offensive in quotes, or suspicious behavior. There may be a call. The call might be on a disturbance. There's often wandering involved, and I'm sure many of you on the webinar today are familiar with how often people with autism are wandering into bodies of water and then they end up drowning, which has actually spurred on some research to address that and make sure that families are able to get the help they need around that issue specifically. And then also seizures may be another sign of police who are interacting with people with disabilities. We do focus on some communication tips on different types of disabilities. We actually bring up fetal alcohol spectrum disorder as a disability as well, since that's less well known in the general public as well as among law enforcement. But this is our slide that focuses on autism. And these are some of the different tips that we talk about, not touching the person, as that can actually cause that person pain, and not approaching the person from behind. Also, the person may not respond to the verbal questions or requests, so just be as reassuring as possible and keep trying again. And then understanding that any kind of sudden outburst or other behavior may occur, so if no one is at risk of harm, to wait. Just wait that behavior out and then calmly continue. And we've seen examples of when this doesn't happen and when the officer does wait things out and what a difference that can make. And we provide those kind of examples in our training and are talking about how to create more video examples like that, so that officers can really see for themselves just how different a situation is based on their behavior, and that the more education they have around it, the more likely everyone is going to walk away safely. I mentioned the Americans with Disabilities Act, and this is an important legislation that requires that people with disabilities get the accommodations they need to have equal access to the justice system. And these are some example accommodations that we provide in the training. One is just to take extra time to ask more questions to determine if a disability exists, and not that they ask specifically, do you have a disability, but to ask questions around trying to find out if a disability may be present. And some examples might be if the person attended any kind of special education classes growing up, finding out where the person is working potentially, finding out where the person lives. So there's other questions that the officer, attorney, or other professional can ask about that. Also, speaking slowly is an important accommodation, especially in this fast-paced world, to remember to slow down, to be more patient, to just know that they've got to check for understanding. And one way that we suggest that happens is by asking that person to repeat back to you what you said, but using their own words. And that can really help the person know whether or not the individual with a disability is understanding what's being said. Using plain language is important, pictures, symbols, communication boards whenever possible, and just making sure that communication is effective there, calling on local disability agencies, trying to look for accommodations by assisting filling out forms as needed, and then not questioning people without a support person. And this is really key because this is where people can get into some serious problems in the system that have disabilities when someone isn't present because they can be forced to say things. And this is actually in the IACP's model policy, is that a support person needs to be present if a person with disabilities is being questioned about a crime. This is how we end our training. It's how to spot hidden disabilities and thinking through the different steps that officers can take and that it actually can save someone's life. First of all, looking deeper. So we have to remind individuals who work in the criminal justice system, if they've had no personal experience around disability and autism, that there can often be these hidden disabilities, and they're identified by behaviors and not appearance, and sometimes just not identified until the person discloses that they have a disability. So it's important to look deeper into those situations. And then secondly, to slow down, to call a supervisor, a support staff person to the scene, and to call the person's family member, support staff, or advocate. And then thirdly, just ask themselves, what is really going on here? And how could disability be playing a role? And then seeking assistance so that it's not only the officer, it's not only the attorney or other professional in the system who is assisting that individual, but bringing in others who have an understanding and expertise on disability issues. So I just wanted to mention a few resources that have come out recently that is really interesting in looking at this topic. And one of them is the Impact Feature issue on justice and disability issues. This is an online resource that has a number of different topics on intellectual developmental disability and criminal justice. And it's real easy to flip in between different articles. It's just been such a great resource for many people in the field, so I've got that link there. And then we did a magazine article through Police Chief. That is the magazine for the International Association of Chiefs of Police that I mentioned earlier. And this article is focusing on how you can use procedural justice, and that's sort of a law enforcement term that basically means that we need to better legitimize policing by treating people fairly. And so we applied that to how law enforcement should also treat people with disabilities. And so that article is focused on that issue. And as I mentioned earlier, I wanted to provide you the website information for NCCJD, and that is here. You'll find the website. We also have a Facebook page where we post about 3 times a week of timely topics and issues that are going on in our society around this. And so I hope that you'll visit that and like our page. I have a link directly to the Pathways to Justice training where you can look at some testimonials of people that have been through the training, as well as get a better sense of what's involved for each of the professions and what they learn through the training. And then lastly, I just wanted to mention that NPR, they have what's called the Abused and Betrayed series, where a reporter at NPR spent a good year looking at victims, people with disabilities who have experienced sexual violence. And that entire series is available on their website. And I think this is a great segue too for our next speaker, Samantha Crane. She's going to be focusing on this topic, but more specifically around victimization issues. So I thank you for listening today, and I look forward to answering any questions you might have. Thank you.
Okay, so Samantha, take it away.
Hi, can everyone hear me? I'm
yes.
okay, great. I'm using a phone to call in because my work phone is not working, so please just bear with me. I also am going to have to be asking people to advance my slides. If I can ask really quickly before we move on, because I wasn't able to see the poll due to my internet issues when we started. Yeah, great, thank you. So we've got a lot of parents, relatives. That's great. Okay. So let's move on to my thing. Okay, great. So ASAN, I am the Director of Public Policy at ASAN. We are the nation's largest advocacy group by and for autistic people ourselves. So we have an all-autistic leadership plus a majority of our board and many chapters. Those chapters are now spinning off into affiliates. I've got to update the slide, but we have a pretty large grassroots base. If we can go to the next slide. So as Leigh said, I'll be talking a little bit about victims issues in the autistic community. And there is quite a significant need for more awareness of victims with disabilities. The graphs on this slide, you can see that people with disabilities from 2009 to 2015 have a rate of between 25 and 35 per 1,000 people are victimized each year in a violent crime. And that's compared to around 12 or 15% of per 1,000 of people without disability. That's based on the Bureau of Justice. Can we go back? Bureau of Justice Statistics survey. People with cognitive and independent living disabilities, if you look at Table 4, have an even higher rate of violent crime victimization, including serious violent crime victimization, than people with other disabilities. With cognitive disabilities, it's about 60 people per 1,000 each year experience a violent crime. That's just a lot. And we believe that cognitive and independent living disabilities, that's usually where people on the autism spectrum are going to be classified. So it's a very, very large rate. There is also a high percentage of crimes, according to this same study by the Bureau of Justice Statistics, a high percentage of these crimes are by people known to the victim. People with disabilities are at high risk for abuse, bullying, and even crimes like trafficking. Next slide. It's not just the risk, the overall risk, that can be a problem. So when law enforcement respond to people with disabilities, they are going to often experience additional challenges from when interacting with the police. That can include communication challenges, and those challenges are even worse when police aren't able to provide communication supports. People might be ignored or disbelieved by the police. If there's an issue of intra-family abuse or even abuse within a group home. Police might see it as a private issue and not treat it as an actual case of assault or neglect. Cases of abuse are not prosecuted very often, and part of the reason why cases aren't prosecuted very often is that law enforcement might assume that the victim won't be able to testify credibly at trial. They might think the person will be deemed by the judge to be incompetent to testify. They might think that it would be too hard on the victim, that the victim won't have the emotional capacity to testify. They might think that no one will believe the victim. People might have an additional need for assistance navigating the criminal system. And they might have, as part of that assistance, they might need coordination between different response agencies like the police, adult protective services, and child protective services. For example, if someone goes into the system as a victim, there's a lot of phone calls that need to be made, keeping in touch with police, keeping in touch with prosecutors, going to different places to make a statement. You might call the wrong place. So if someone's experiencing abuse, they might call adult protective services. That agency might not necessarily talk to the police who got called by the same person 2 weeks ago. So you need a lot of coordination on that area. And then finally, sometimes, especially with people who have communication challenges, the individual's response to abuse may be seen as a problem. So if you have someone who is not speaking and they don't have appropriate communication supports, you might see them leaving their group home, running away, leaving their family home and running away, leaving a school, and people will treat that as a behavioral issue, a behavioral problem, but really this person's trying to escape another individual who might be abusing them. Next slide. So when you're responding to a potential victim, and this applies to teachers, family members, loved ones, as well as law enforcement, you really want to, first of all, figure out if the disability is a factor. So sometimes if a person is targeted for a disability, there might be hate crimes protections. You need to figure out what happened. So what supports can you give this person to help tell you what happened? Are they able to report? Is there some other information that you can go to figure out what happened? Are there other witnesses? If they can't report what happened reliably, look at the person's reactions to other people. Are they showing fear of an individual? Are they trying to escape a situation? If there's an abuse situation or an exploitation situation, sometimes you're going to find the person's not cooperating or doesn't seem to be seeking out help. That might be because the person thinks that the way that they're being treated is normal. And Leanne sort of talked about this in her presentation, that people on the autism spectrum might be very susceptible to influence by others. They might think the person who's abusing them is their friend. They might think they need the person who's abusing them. Maybe they have difficulty living on their own independently. The person abusing them is helping them. They might not be aware of how serious or dangerous a situation is. They might think, again, maybe it's normal, maybe this person's not. Maybe their sense of who is a dangerous person and who's not a dangerous person might not be very good. And if they're being abused, can they get help? Can they go to a safe place? Some shelters are very overwhelming or inaccessible to people on the autism spectrum, so it might be necessary to help someone think through another safe place to go where they can escape the violence, obtain victim services or counseling, and can they bring their independent living supports with them when they go. That's a big issue. And we see this with support workers and police that when people aren't thinking through those issues, they might not necessarily get cooperation from the individual, because if the individual thinks like, well, if police are going to get involved, I'm going to have to leave my home, I'm not going to have anywhere to go, I'm not going to have any supports, they might decide that they don't want police involved. Can we go to the next slide? People on the autism spectrum might have special communication needs, and these include motor and sensory needs, augmentative communication. People might prefer text-based communication versus speech communication. They might need an interpreter. They might need cognitive communication supports like simple language. Repeating information to people can be very helpful. Visual aids can be helpful to help people understand the process, especially the process. Redirection, people might need help staying on topic and talking about the thing that they need to talk about. They might start talking about something else. Sometimes people might even need an individual to help translate information into words that they understand. They might need emotional support. They might need help from supporters in their life. They might need redirection as an emotional support. And tone of voice is very important. A lot of the time when police or professionals or friends and family are responding to a situation, they might start talking like parents. Oh, honey, what's going on? And a lot of people with disabilities, including people on the autism spectrum, get distressed by that. They like a neutral tone of voice. For people who are police or first responders, can we go to the next slide? There's a duty to communicate effectively. So it's not just that it's a good idea, but you have a duty to communicate effectively with people with disabilities under Title II of the ADA. And that includes also giving people reasonable accommodations. If it's your policy that everyone has to make a report on the phone, they might be entitled to a reasonable accommodation. Next slide. Sorry, next. Can we? Oh, yeah, that is the right slide. If someone, this is a slide, I don't know if I have time to read all the way through it, but if you need it, you can get it from the presenters later. There's a whole list of ways that you can support someone with communication needs that are motor or sensory. Let's say a person can't generate speech, they need help to communicate from a motor planning perspective. AAC devices are really important. It's important to ask if a person who can't speak has a device or a letter board or a picture board that they use to communicate. They're not interchangeable, so you can't simply say, well, we have an iPad, we'll give it to them, that person will use the iPad. People who use AAC devices might only be able to use their own. It's important to give people extra time to communicate and not interrupt. That can sometimes make it difficult to communicate. A lot of people, even people who can speak, are much better at using text. So that's an important thing to be able to offer people. Sometimes people might need an interpreter, and that can include not only ASL interpreters, but sometimes even speech-to-speech interpreters. People might have motor issues speaking. Their words might not be easy to hear, and someone who's familiar with them will be able to interpret. Sometimes people will need friends and family to interpret. So if there's a concern about abuse inside the family, try and get interpretation from a neutral person who might know the individual well. And you might even be able to, do a double confirmation where you ask someone, yes or no questions outside of the presence of others, and then get more information inside the presence of others and see if they're consistent. Next slide. Cognitive communication needs, again, visual aids, simple language, repetition. Next slide. Keeping on topic can be difficult with individuals who have intellectual and developmental disabilities. It can require a lot of patience and interview skills. This can be especially an issue when someone has just experienced trauma. They might have a hard time staying on topic and following what you're saying. They might need frequent breaks. In order to keep people on topics, it can help to have a visual agenda. It can also help to ask really concrete questions with very specific answers. Instead of saying, well, tell me the whole story, try and prompt people. What happened right after that? What did they say right then? Polite interruptions can sometimes be helpful. And sometimes when a person seems to be off topic, they actually are on topic. You just don't understand how it relates yet. So sometimes it can help to simply say, you know, I'm sorry, I don't understand how this relates to what happened. Can you explain this a little bit more to me? Because this is difficult, it's important to have a little extra time, more time than you necessarily think you need in order to go through what's going on. Next slide. Sometimes when people are talking, it's going to be difficult to understand what they mean. Statements might be ambiguous, but that doesn't mean that they're not trying to communicate something very important. So it can help to mirror statements back in your own words. As Leanne said, in a law enforcement context, when you're talking to a person during a crisis, it can help to have to say things in different ways and have the other person mirror back what you're saying. Mirroring can work in the opposite direction too. If someone says something that you don't understand, you can say, wait a minute, let me see if I understand what you're saying. Are you saying blah? And that can help. You have to make sure that you're not trying to lead people in one way or another. But if you're trying to mirror back in a very neutral way, it can be helpful. It can help to ask for documentation. Sometimes if a person was a victim of, let's say, a financial crime, it can help to just say, like, wait a minute, can I just see your bank statement? Might make a lot more sense. And if a client is literate and they seem to be talking ambiguously, that might be an indication that they work better through text or through some other communication method. Next slide. It's important to develop trust. If a person is having a hard time talking, you might want to, build rapport, talking about something that they're very interested in, something that makes them happy. And you don't necessarily know what makes them happy, but it can help to say, like, what do you like to do? Tell me about something you like. People might have a bit better of a time relating to if they've had an icebreaker. It's important to ensure access to supporters, again, because so many crimes committed against people with disabilities are intimate violence. It can be helpful to get supporters who are sort of outside whatever situation. But hopefully people will have those supporters. You have to also balance the presence of supporters with the need for privacy and interview. So sometimes people might want to bring a supporter to the office, but then the supporter waits outside, and it can be helpful to simply know the supporter is outside. If there is a supporter, of course, you want to speak directly to the individual, not to the support person. And it's also important to ask who the person wants supporting them. Sometimes it's not intuitive who the person feels most comfortable around. And you might want to connect people with peer advocates who can help them if there's no obvious supporter in the picture. Again, redirection and tone of voice can also be really important. Next slide. If you get to the point where someone might need to testify in court, it's important to be prepared to educate the court about how to support a person's communication needs. Courts are also covered by Title II of the ADA. So if a person needs a reasonable accommodation in court, they really might be entitled to this. You might need to prepare in advance to show that they have capacity to testify. And that means, they are able to understand what happened. They are able to describe what happened accurately. They understand the meaning of having to tell the truth. And it can be important to say, like that the person can do this with an accommodation, for example, AAC. A final thing, and because we've actually seen this happen in some cases, is I would never use a victim as demonstrative evidence. Sometimes when a person with a disability is a victim, especially if they're non-speaking, they're not testifying, but someone wants to show the jury how vulnerable the victim is, they'll simply bring the victim in as an exhibit as a trial. This is really not something you want to do because it's treating an individual as a prop. And you should never assume that a person doesn't know that they're being treated as a prop and they don't know what's going on, even if they can't communicate very well with you. You have to assume that they understand what's happening. So never treat a person as a prop. Find a different way to bring that information in. And finally, we have some resources. The next slide. We have some resources for people who want to learn more. Our safety toolkit at autisticadvocacy.org/safety is a very comprehensive resource that includes a lot of discussion of how to respond to violence and abuse. We have a toolkit on communication that we did with the University of California, San Francisco that discusses in a lot more detail the ways that you can support communication for people on the autism spectrum. The ABA Commission on Disability Rights has a lot of resources, especially for lawyers who want to represent people with disabilities and deal with disability in the courtroom. And state courts, the ABA also has a resource for state court accessibility, which also is helpful in the courtroom. And then I'll turn this over back to the moderator in case we have questions. I'm sorry we went a little over.
No worries. Thank you so much. I think just because we're short on time, we'll just ask two very general questions, and then if others have questions that we don't get to, you can always email us at webinars@sparkforautism.org, and we can do our best to answer those for you. So someone did have a question about the various affiliates for ASAN. So do you have any in Southern California?
I think we do have an LA affiliate. I can check really quickly. If you want to ask the next question, I will give you a better answer.
And then the other question was, are police officer trainings available throughout the U.S.? I think this is probably more for you, Leanne.
Sure. Can everyone hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So we actually piloted the training in 2015 where we went to 5 different sites and piloted the Pathways to Justice training. And then we did 6 additional trainings in last year, in 2017. So we've covered 11 states so far. And what's really exciting is we got continuation grant funding through the Bureau of Justice Assistance. And they're putting together a national center that law enforcement and others can go to request training. And it's actually going to be looking at both intellectual developmental disabilities that includes autism as well as mental health. And so we're hoping that within this year, once that center gets up and running, we can start directing people to BJA's National Center where they can ask for the training through that, so that Pathways to Justice will be on BJA's website. People will be able to access it through there. But we're also going to continue to provide it to our through our local chapters and other disability organizations that want to provide it in their community. So our goal right now is to, for anyone who wants to provide a training, we would work with them to look for funding in order to bring that training to their community. So it's definitely a group effort, and it's a way to get communities to really work together in addressing the topic.
Okay, thank you. So I don't want to keep people too much longer, but again, you can always email us at webinars@sparkforautism.org with any additional questions about this topic. Sam, did you by chance find out about the affiliate in California?
Yes, we have one in Sacramento and one in LA. However, since we're kind of currently in the process of converting all of our chapters to affiliates, it's a little bit in flux. So just watch this space. Okay.
All right. So I want to thank you both for your time. This was excellent. Really enjoyed your presentation. That's really all the time we have right now. So